Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We realize we're counter-programming Hester's talk on the main stage, so it means a lot that you're all here. Maybe I'd like the panelists to introduce themselves and say a few words about the projects that they're associated with, and one sort of frame that I'd like you to address as you're doing an introduction is this very provocative title, The Battle of the Layer Ones. Are we battling? Who are we battling against? Each other? I hope not. Or is it the regulatory environment? So why don't we start on this side? Just introduce yourself, please, a little bit about your product and whether we're at war with each other or someone else.
All right, can you hear me? So thank you for being the few and the proud who wanted to show up for our session and talk about decentralization or tech or all other fun things. So I'm Thomas Chow. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Chia Network. We are the most decentralized Layer 1 blockchain. I will make a provocative comment right there. Are we rivals? Yes. Are we at war? No. I think actually amongst this panel are people who I work with on a very regular basis and who I'm probably part of 3 or 4 chat groups with. We do bicker amongst ourselves, and we have a good time while we do it, but I don't think we're necessarily at war with each other. We are, I think, trying to do different things, and each of our layer ones, I think, is capable of different sorts of markets, creating different sorts of swaps, enabling different sorts of use cases. And so I don't think we're necessarily at war, but like I said, we are decentralization maxis. I know that may not be a kosher sort of a statement anymore, given that the way the industry, I think, is pushing toward moving away from decentralization now that we have a more permissive regulatory environment and a new administration. But at the end of the day, we happen to believe that technical architecture matters, and it should affect how we are or are not regulated. And I'll leave it with that.
Well, thanks, Thomas. Lee?
Hi, everybody. Lee Schneider. I'm the general counsel at Avalabs. We work on the Avalanche blockchain. I was going to do my best Hulk Hogan impression and rip my shirt off before the battle here, but figure in this environment, maybe that's not appropriate. I completely disagree with everything that Thomas just said. No, we also believe in decentralization, so I'm not sure that where the centralization part is coming in. But we also believe that blockchains will be multi-purpose. And so there can be good situations for centralized applications. In terms of technical architecture, I will say something that hopefully is provocative, which is everybody forgets that even centralized databases, centrally maintained databases are made up of lots of different servers. And when you have lots of different servers, whether they are centrally maintained or decentralized, you need a way for those servers to agree on a common data set. And blockchains, either Nakamoto consensus or various types of proof of stake consensus, tend to be really good ways to do that. And I personally think all of that should be encouraged. The last thing I'll say in the introduction is a lot of people underestimate the value of publicly available infrastructure. And that's what the internet is, and that's what blockchains are, and that will drive a huge amount of commerce, creativity, and cost savings. I managed to get C's for all of those. That was unplanned, I apologize. And I think that's something that is not discussed as much as it should be.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Amira?
I think this is going to be really fun.
Oh, good.
My name is Amira. I am at the Solana Foundation, which advocates on behalf of the decentralization, security, and adoption of the Solana blockchain. Solana blockchain is a permissionless, open source, ultra fast, ultra cheap, ultra energy efficient layer 1 blockchain. The way we think about the world is about being able to create basically internet capital markets on chain. So if we have an open network that allows for people to trade everything from on one side of the spectrum, meme coins, all the way to financial products like BlackRock, money market funds that are tokenized, all on chain. It creates a globally accessible, permissionless network that is open access to the world. Does that mean that there's only one blockchain that wins? No, absolutely not. I think the reason that we all work together constantly is because we believe in growing the overall pie. And I think each of the organizations or sort of blockchains that each of us represent comes at the world from a slightly different vantage point, and I think there's probably room for all of them. But that is sort of the very specific Solana view on the world that is I think something that you'll see over and over again advanced from my colleagues at the foundation, the original creators of the blockchain, and so forth.
Jacob.
Hi everyone, my name is Jacob Hample. I lead government affairs for the Filecoin Foundation. Filecoin is a decentralized cloud storage network. So we're a little bit different from, I guess, some of the other more general purpose layer ones that are on the panel here. But yeah, the mission statement of the Filecoin Foundation is to preserve humanity's most important information. So we believe that data is important, and data is more important when data is resilient. And so we strive to have the most resilient, most, cost-effective and easy-to-use distributed data system. Because at the end of the day, everyone has data that they need. I know, for instance, the historical blockchain record of Solana's blockchain is stored on Filecoin. But yeah, so we tend to live in a little bit of a different space. You can build on top of the Filecoin network through the virtual machine to try to create smart contracts for storage clients. But then we're also very active within the DPIN policy community too, which I know Amira also spends a lot of time in.
Okay, great. Well, this is a policy and regulatory summit primarily, so I want to get into Fit 21 and market structure, but sort of a predicate to that occurred to me, which is over the prior administration, this industry sector, I think, had a very justified sense that they were under attack in large part by the financial services regulators, and the SEC was really the chief antagonist to the industry sector. Needless to say, things have changed dramatically over the past few months. So when we're thinking about the importance of legislation or major official regulatory changes through, for example, a notice and comment period, is there less urgency right now? I mean, how do you all see that? Is that not as important to achieve because the status quo is more palatable to your businesses? That question is for anyone with the courage to take it first.
I think it's still important. I think you wouldn't know that anything is less urgent between the number of messages that get sent to our group chats that Thomas was referencing earlier. Overall, I think the market needs certainty. Yes, there is a more favorable view among people in the administration now than in the last administration, but administrations last 4 years, Congress's last 2 years. And in order to get people comfortable with using and building on these systems, you have to have some sort of legislation in place that will last and have a little bit more permanence.
I'll actually say, I think it's actually more important now. And the reason I say that is the last 4 years, again, Chia's regulatory stance was a little bit different. We actually did, Gary Gensler said come in and file. So we walked in and registered. And so we actually went through the S1 process. It was a lot of fun. For those of you who actually really want to get into the weeds of it, take a look at our crypto task force meeting logs. Our entire confidential S1, as well as all of the comment letters from the SEC and the way we cleared comments is all in there. So if you want to read it and you want to get a feeling for how the SEC was thinking about things, go ahead and get a read. But the reason why I say it's more important now is now that the industry as a whole doesn't feel like we have to hide under a rock anymore, we can actually start debating the things that really matter to us. So how much does decentralization matter? How much does security matter? How much do we want to be regulated, when we know that we have not quite a blank check, but something closer to that? And in my mind, we have to get this right, because if we get it wrong and we pass legislation that is, say, far too permissive and basically allows anyone and their mother to issue a coin, I don't want to make comments about politicians issuing meme coins, but if anyone could issue a coin or a token and set up their own blockchain, one of these days the market is going to crash, because markets are cyclical, no different in crypto. There will be a crash, people will lose a lot of money, and that what we thought was a great victory in legislation is going to be targeted on a bipartisan basis, and we're going to have a Pyrrhic victory. And so if we get it right now, and we can define the parameters correctly in a way that most of us agree, I'm not going to say all of us agree, but at least enough of us agree, is sensible and reasonable and has the right level of protections for both consumers as well as projects, then we're going to have something that will actually last. And if we don't get that right, I think we have something that lasts maybe at best 2 to 4 years, and then we're back and we're going to eventually have a screaming regulator or screaming legislators, in congressional hearings, which are a lot of grandstanding. It will happen again. And that to me is just, that means the industry is going to go from hiding under a rock to celebrating and grave dancing to hiding under a rock again. And that's just not productive.
I'll add a coda to that. I agree. And I'll echo, yeah, it's reflected in our group chats. Like, it is the Super Bowl right now in crypto policy worlds. And the Super Bowl probably lasts like 12 to 18 months in this case, right? So there's a really limited window with which to get legislation over the line. And the thing that I would add is it's not just critical for industry, but if one of the things that we're interested in seeing is for crypto and TradFi to intersect and to start seeing institutions start to use the blockchain, they're not interested in a pendulum swing every 2 or 4 years, right? They want to work and build things that last, because these are institutions that have been around for decades, if not hundreds of years. And so what they're looking for is really clear rules of the road and confidence that if they do something today, 4 years from now, that product or that partnership or that blockchain they launch can still work. And so I think there is a deep sense of urgency, and we feel it not just because we have a particular window in time, but because when institutions are talking about using blockchain, they are interested in getting something done.
Sorry, Dan. I strongly agree with everything. I just want to add one point, which is the thing that we are most focused on in all of the legislation talk, regulation talk, et cetera, is token classification. If we don't get those definitions right, if we don't get the definition of whatever this new asset class is that's either going to be regulated by the SEC or the CFTC or a combination of the two or some third regulator or SRO or whatever everybody dreams up, if we don't get those definitions right at the beginning, then it's a mess. And the reason it's a mess is because of all of these companies that want to build all different kinds of things on blockchains, including, whether Thomas likes it or not, meme coins. I did a meme coin. Anybody can do it. It's fun. It's a good learning experience, right? Like, so people should have that ability to experiment. You can't buy my meme coin. You can only mint it. Dogeworld.club. Go have fun. No, I made my own website. Right? Like this. I'm a friggin' lawyer, and I did that, right? So think about that while I give the rest of my spiel here, which is we do need to get that classification right, because just because something sits on a blockchain doesn't make it a financial instrument, doesn't make it a security or a derivative, et cetera, et cetera. But we do have this class of assets. I call them native DLT tokens. You call them whatever you want to call them, that are new and different because they are intrinsic to the blockchains or to the protocols. And that's something new, and we've got to figure out how that gets regulated. But that doesn't mean that everything else gets swept up in that regulation unless we make the conscious choice to do it that way. But again, to Thomas's point, we got to have that discussion.
Well, I really like Amira's point about the sort of permanence of legislation, particularly as we start to see the digital native world converging with the traditional financial sector, and the traditional financial institutions want that confidence, right? That this is something that's lasting and there's some permanence. We've already seen as an industry the sort of back and forth from the prudential banking regulators, and that just doesn't give the industry a high degree of confidence. But how do we do this? I mean, the Senate right now is taking up stable coins. That seems to be the priority, but ultimately, we do need to have some sort of overall market structure legislation that presumably will include some sort of taxonomy between the different types of assets in this rapidly evolving asset class where there are nearly infinite varieties of tokens that can be created with completely different properties and characteristics. So from afar, at least, where I sit, looking at the legislation, it seems like a lot of the conversation is still revolving around Fit 21. So are we on the right track with Fit 21? How do you see that legislation? Lee, do you want to start?
So I think there's three things I would say about Fit 21. Number one is I'm not sure it quite got the definition of digital asset right, at least the way that I think about it. And I think that its definition is maybe a little bit too broad, such that it would pull in things that are not intended to be in there. At least I hope that they are not intended to be in there. The second thing I'll say about Fit 21 is the test of decentralization, I think, is clunky and difficult and could cause a lot of problems, in part because something could be centralized, then decentralized, then centralized, then decentralized. And that sort of ping-ponging back and forth for regulator jurisdiction seems like that's more difficulty than is needed. So I just said two negative things about it. I'm going to say a positive thing about it, which is I actually think they did a good job of describing the types of intermediaries in Fit 21 and describing this concept of ancillary activities that are outside of regulation, because I think those two things are very important. We can't have infrastructure be intermediaries, and we have to make sure that token functionality that is infrastructure is not regulated under the securities laws or the commodity futures laws. So that's my nutshell on Fit 21.
Thomas, I saw a smile come across your face. Thoughts on Fit?
We are actually generally fans of Fit 21. I think, look, no legislation is going to make everybody happy, but I think that the drafters, the staff who put their heart and soul into it, were at least thinking about it conceptually, in my mind, in a correct way, because how they differentiated between restricted digital assets to whether it's a digital commodity really did focus a lot on decentralization and control criteria. And we can argue about whether those were the right criteria, and I'm actually going to posit that I think they actually didn't make it stringent enough when it comes to decentralization, because under the current definitions, you could have a Nakamoto coefficient probably around 3 as drafted, maybe 5. Am I willing as a person to support 5 as the right number? Sure, but I think it actually should be north of that, because when you think about how many parties you want to be able to collude to be able to overtake a chain, spend, double spend, rug, rewrite the chain, you want it to be higher, not lower. And as that number goes up, even by single digits, the probability of collusion actually becomes far more difficult to achieve. And so I think Fit 21 actually could have gotten more aggressive, and that was our original written feedback to the drafters was you should be aiming for a double-digit Nakamoto coefficient. And I know not every chain does that, and in fact, full disclosure, in Chia right now, we are not double-digit Nakamoto coefficient. We were in the 120 range or so for the last year and a half, and then we've dropped because of some weird software bugs that we're now trying to patch to prevent more pooling errors. But we still think that's the right direction. So I think higher decentralization is the right way to do it. I understand that people don't like bifurcated markets. I really don't know how to solve that one. That's really my issue. Is if you try to solve bifurcated
Can I
markets,
solve it for you right now?
you can, but I'm going to just say this: if you have a singular market and you have to regulate it, no one's going to like that regulation. And I don't think the answer is. I personally don't think the answer is tokens are not inherently securities, because I know people will posit, even here on the panel, that tokens are software and a different financial asset class. I don't think they're a new asset class. Tokens have existed for a long time. They're literally just digital representations of something. And what you have to evaluate is what that something is. And if that something has governance rights and can control a network, even if it's not a corporate network, but it can control a blockchain network, and you can have enough stake to then overtake the entire system and rewrite the economics, I'm sorry, you deserve to be regulated. And I don't know if you want to call it a security or not. I'll posit that it's probably a security or something like a security, but either way, it should be regulated. And so how you solve a bifurcated market at that point, then either it's you have a bifurcated market, you have a free-for-all, or you have a restricted market where no one's happy.
Lee, solve it.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I disagree with a lot of what Thomas just said. I think using
getting good now.
decentralization as the test for whether or not something is regulated or how it's regulated might be a factor, but is not, to me, the be-all and end-all of yes, it's a security, or no, it's not a security, it's something else. But that's not. That's neither here nor there for purposes of the solution. The solution is we should allocate responsibility. We should properly define what the asset is, regardless of whether or not it's decentralized. We should define what we mean by token in this case. And then we should throw the jurisdiction to both the SEC and the CFTC. And we already have two excellent regulators. Sometimes they're not always excellent, but for purposes of this conference, they're excellent. We have two excellent regulators who know how to regulate markets and already have regulated intermediaries. And there's no reason we need to remake all of that just because we have a new asset class or just because we've decided that there's a new asset class. So to my mind, that's the easiest solution in my pie-in-the-sky world that I live in. Whether that is a practical solution from a political standpoint or otherwise, I don't know. But to me, that's the right solution here. It creates a larger market for everybody. It allows existing intermediaries that are regulated by each to function in that market. It doesn't require that everything get rewritten. It leverages the existing regulatory frameworks and regulatory expertise. And from my perspective, that's what we should want. We should want as many actors in the space as we can get, and we should want as big a marketplace as we can get.
Amira, how are you seeing it, Fit 21, and do you have any thoughts on the decentralization definition that's contained there?
I'll say a few things. One is I will give a shout out to government employees who work year in, year out and have expertise in a certain area, because I will say, no matter what you think of a piece of legislation, I agree with Thomas, like there's no piece of legislation that everyone's going to be completely comfortable with. They really, the writers here and staffers have really poured their heart and soul into trying to get really strong market structure legislation that is comprehensive and makes sense and works for enough parties to be able to get across our legislative process, and it's really hard to do. So I think generally we were comfortable with Fit 21. I think it wasn't perfect legislation, and I don't think that's what we're going to get at this next at-bat with the market structure bill. I think we're going to see all this feedback be taken into account, and I think we'll see something that has been refreshed and new. Generally speaking, I think decentralization as a principle is pretty important when we're thinking about this type of new asset or whatever you want to call it that we should bring into sort of the regulatory fold. And I think there's a distinction between the asset that is tied to the utility of a functioning blockchain and a bunch of other assets that are out there. So this is Lee's point on token classification, right? Like what it takes to be sort of the utility asset that is tied to a blockchain is different from a lot of the other things that you'll see trading on top of it. For decentralization related to things that will be basically like the native token of a blockchain, there's like kind of a common sense view of what decentralization is, which Lee, you've said this like more thoughtfully or concisely than I ever had. But the idea is like no one person or small group of people can collude to write, read, or take down the network, right? And that's really what you want to be thinking about. And the question is, how do you concretize that into law? How do you take something that feels like visible and you get a sense for it and then translate that into words on pages? And I think we're just going to have to figure out like what the right next rev of that looks like on paper.
Jacob, I mean, you mentioned that you can build on top of Filecoin, right? So in that way, you're sort of in league with a lot of the layer ones, but you do have an orientation around a very like specific purpose. And so do you see Filecoin fitting in to, or like adequately dealt with in some of the legislative proposals that have been put on the table?
Yeah, I do think so. And I think it's important to note that when the drafters were writing FIT or have thought of like, other legislation that's been proposed in the past, there's not like, 14 different classifications of different types of tokens, right? They classify digital assets. And I think that the reason for that is because it's hard to know like where technology is going to go in the future. I think that's a very interesting part of the way that FIT is drafted too, that I think it's like worth noting, is that FIT was written in a kind of different political environment than we're in now. And so it was written in a environment with a very hostile SEC. And so I think a lot of the text that's in FIT 21 is like, decently prescriptive to the point where it might not necessarily in previous legislation or other sort of goals, if you had an environment where the drafters were assuming that let's just say that no one can have control, and then we'll leave it to the SEC to write regs about what that actually means, and we'll just leave it to them. I feel like that's a very common tactic if you're a staffer in the House or the Senate. But I think the way it was written was to try to put some guardrails on what an aggressive SEC could do. And so politically, it's, I think, an interesting question now about how prescriptive do you want to be in this environment? Do you want to give the SEC and CFTC some leeway in their rulemaking process? And so I think those sort of questions are going to keep on being discussed at the staff level and potentially with industry input as well.
Yeah, a question that I get asked a lot that I hate getting, so I thought it was a great idea to ask this group. Are there other jurisdictions that are doing it right? I mean, is there precedent here, right? You can see the hunger sort of from the legislators, right? Well, you're telling us that we've got a murky, at best, regulatory environment. So what should we be looking towards? Any jurisdictions you like?
I think there's no perfect jurisdiction. Everyone's doing things a little differently that has some little problems. I think it is, it's interesting to witness the way that different countries, regulatory regimes, impact the way that they're approaching this. For instance, in the EU, they don't have the issue of the CFTC versus SEC sort of problem. But they do have a federal system with all these different NCAs in every single country where ESMA can only give guidance. And so that's causing a lot implementation problems as far as when everything's going to come online, that I know a lot of us are watching pretty closely. And then at the same time, they have the key question isn't SEC or CFTC, it's MiFID or not MiFID. So MiFID is the European financial services regulation, and so basically in the base text, it just says if if the only distinction between like an asset is it's on a blockchain versus like any other way that you would regulate it, like that doesn't inherently change the way it should be regulated. If it's if it's a tokenized stock, it'll be treated like a stock, which is I think the correct way to approach it. But we're just now starting to see how all the different NCAs in each individual European country are going to interpret that MiFID status, and they can interpret it differently because they each have their own prerogative as national securities or financial regulators. So all of that I think is going to be stuff to keep an eye on as we move forward. But it's certainly interesting to see the way that different structural systems are impacting the different pain points in this regulatory process.
Are we going to get market structure legislation passed and signed this year? Amira, what do you think? We can ask a number of people who are here somewhere. But
I do think so.
I would love for you to
I think we
speculate.
will get market. I feel very confident we will see stablecoin legislation, and I feel reasonably confident we will get market structure legislation. Betting on Congress is a pretty difficult thing to do generally. A lot has to go right to get legislation across the line, but I think we see people who are very motivated, and a lot of the pieces of the puzzle are in place in order to get these things onto the president's desk and signed.
Final thoughts. I think we're getting the hook, everyone. Lee, do you want to speculate wildly about whether we're going to get, not in general, whether we're going to get some market
I would like
structure
to see you
legislation?
speculate wildly generally.
I will speculate wildly.
Please.
Before the end of this year, we will have stablecoin legislation signed, market structure legislation signed, Bitcoin will hit 250, and there will be at least 3 multi-coin ETFs approved by the SEC. How's that for wild speculation?
This is the perfect place to end the panel. Thank you.
You heard it
Lee.
first.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to the audience for sticking with us.